Mr. Trudeau, you're praising a hero, as you said, your hero, Mr. Zelensky, President of Ukraine. He's a democratic leader chosen by his own people. But it seems like, and he is a hero of democracy for you. Am I right? Yes. You just said so when you've been talking to Mr. Zelensky. Why he is a hero of democracy? Do you know, Mr. Trudeau, that Mr. Zelensky came to his power and what he'd been promising to his own people in Ukraine, that he will be standing in front of the mothers on his knee and asking for the forgiveness for the war. Because maybe you don't really know, but for 8 years in Ukraine we had a civil war. Probably you don't know about that, but Ukrainians been killing Ukrainians for 8 years, with the 14,000 people being killed, and there are no news anywhere. So the people in Canada or around the world, they have no idea what's been happening in Ukraine. But for the past 8 years, it's been a war there. And you've been supporting the regime, Ukrainian regime, which been killing their own people. And you've been supporting Mr. Zelensky. Zelensky came to power 3 years ago, and the people choose him just because he seems to be different from the other president, Mr. Poroshenko, which we all thought that he's gonna act differently, that he's gonna stop the war. And what's happened? Did he stop the war? Now you're all clapping to him. The whole parliament is clapping to Mr. Zelensky. Why? Do you know what's happening? Do you know, guys, that Canada was supporting Ukraine from 2014, when they had a revolt in Ukraine, which been sponsored by the Western government, like everywhere else, in Iraq, like in Libya, like in Afghanistan. They did the same. The part which is pro-Russian part, they didn't want to join that Ukraine in 2014, but it's still Ukrainian people. So they started to fight each other. For sure, you choose the regime government, you know. You didn't choose the rebels, like in Syria, but you choose the regime because the regime is pro-Western regime. And what Mr. Zelensky did for 8 years, for 3 years he'd been in power. For 3 years, he did nothing. Nothing. He closed the rest of the opposition channels in Ukraine. He shut down all the opposition. And what you've been doing? You've been supporting Mr. Zelensky with everything. You haven't seen what's been happening in Ukraine for those 8 years. No, you haven't seen. You haven't seen any shootings, any bombings of Donbass. You haven't seen it. But why you should see it? It doesn't really matter because you're on the other side of the world. And for sure, you're fighting Russia. Russia is an evil country, like China, Russia, Iran. Those are evil powers, you know. Without them, the world will be peaceful. Because United States and the West, they're bringing peace to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Libya. Those countries, I guess they're prosperous countries right now. after you've been there, after you've been supporting them, after you invaded them. So what's the deal, Mr. Trudeau? You know what's been happening. You've been supporting Ukrainian regime for those years after they decided to be on the opposite side, not close to Russia, but on the opposite side, close to West, like a democracy. You've been supporting them with the weapons, you've been training military, you've been supplying them with the money, you've been pouring money into the country. I don't really understand what's for. You've been training the military. You've been training the military. You've been supporting them with the weapons. For years and years, you've been training them. There was maybe 6,000 military men from Europe and United States and Canada training Ukrainian military. Can I ask you, for what case you've been doing this? What's for? Because you wanted to bring peace to Ukraine. You didn't want to stop the war there. You didn't want to stop the civil war. You wanted to bring the peace. And what's happened? After those 8 years, and especially after 3 years with Mr. Zelensky, what's happened? The war started? Yeah, for sure, because the Putin is such an evil person. And the country is evil. And Mr. Trudeau, you know what you've been doing. You've been supporting the regime. You've been supporting those nationalist battalions in Ukraine. You know that Ukraine, they had the nationalist battalions like Azov and Aidar, which are they're nationalist. But you haven't seen anything. You know that they're supporting Nazi, but you haven't seen it. You haven't seen what's happening in Ukraine. Everything was fine, except the evil Russia. And now you're saying that you're praising this hero president of democracy. And what this hero president done? For his 3 years, he could stop the war. Did he stop the war? Maybe he wanted even to stop the war. But you've been pushing him not to stop. Because it's nice to have a war with Russia, but not with your own hands. It's nice to have a war with Russia, with the Ukrainian hands. You know exactly what's happening, Mr. Trudeau, right now, that the West is fighting Russia. Well, yes, they're fighting with Russia in Ukraine, with the West supplying Ukraine weapons, and still supplying weapons. After 3 weeks of the war, they're still supplying weapons, more weapons to Ukraine. And you know that more civilians will be killed. You know that. And what you're doing? Nothing. You're still supporting the war. And what Mr. Zelensky? He could stop the war. They made an agreement 5 years ago that they had to implement those things in Ukraine. Ukraine haven't done anything. Zero. Zero. You knew that. You've been supporting them. Even you've been telling that you're supporting the Minsk agreement, but you haven't done anything. And Mr. Zelensky, now he's your hero of democracy in the world. What kind of hero he is? There are people fighting in Ukraine, Ukrainian against Ukrainian, and Russian against Russian. What you've done, Mr. Trudeau, you've been supporting this fake hero president democracy president, and now you're lying to your own people. Ukraine is lying to their own people. You wanted them. You grew hatred to Russia. You grew hatred to Russia for 8 years. You've been growing it. Even the Russian people who live in Ukraine, they become Ukrainian. They think that the Putin is evil, that the Russia is evil. That Mr. Trudeau, you've been doing, and you too, by the way. Not just you, the whole Western government, especially United States. And especially you're singing just one song, you know? There are no other songs. You're singing one song which United States started, and we all sing it. Yeah, look at the West. There are no other songs, there are no other views in the world. Just one view, which is the only truth, that the Russia is evil. But tell you people why the Russia becomes so evil. And Mr. Zelensky, he can stop the war even right now. But why he's not stopping the war? Because he doesn't want it to stop. He had chosen to fight till the last soldier. And you, Mr. Trudeau, supporting him with that. Supporting with the weapons, supporting with the money. Because it's not you who are fighting. Not you fighting. But Ukrainians killing Ukrainians. And Russians killing Russia. In Ukraine. And it's just because someone decided that the Russia is evil. You know? And you know that that's the truth. You've been fighting with the Soviet Union for years. Now it's Russia, China, and Iran. Russia and China are superpowers, but you don't want to have it in the world. It must be just one superpower, like United States. And they have to be the military around the whole world. So it's your war. You're fighting with the Ukrainian hands.